In the mists of prehistory, before the crack of gunfire ever echoed through its jungles, Vietnam was a land steeped in myth. Ancient tales spoke of mountains that touched the clouds, of rivers that wound like silver serpents through emerald valleys, and of a people who claimed descent from dragons and immortals. In this realm, long before any foreign banner flew, the seeds of an enduring civilization took root. The oldest legends told of Emperor Hung Vong, a figure both historical and mythical, who is said to have united the scattered tribes into a kingdom along the banks of the Red River Delta. Under his guidance, the people mastered the art of wet rice cultivation, a skill that would anchor Vietnamese society for millennia. In the lowlands, intricate irrigation systems channeled water into lush paddies. In the highlands, bronze drums rang out to mark the rhythms of planting and harvest. This was not yet the Vietnam the world would one day know, but rather Van Lang, a realm of warriors, farmers, and craftsmen whose identity was forged in close communion with the land. The people learned to shape bronze into weapons and tools, to weave silk from the threads of forest moths, and to carve intricate patterns into their drums, telling the story of a people bound to both river and sky. But history, like the rivers of Vietnam, is never still. By 257 BCE, the tides of power shifted. Tuc Phan, a Chinese general of legendary ambition, marched southward, overthrowing the last Hung king and forging the kingdom of Olac. His reign saw the building of Ko Loa Citadel, its spiraling ramparts a marvel of early engineering, designed to protect against enemies both near and far. Trade routes opened, linking the Red River Delta to the markets of southern China, bringing silk, lacquerware, and spices into the hands of merchants who saw opportunity in every tide. Yet no wall is high enough to hold back the flood of history. By 111 BCE, the Han dynasty swept in from the north, marking the first great foreign domination of Vietnam. Chinese governors imposed taxes, built garrisons, and sought to imprint Confucian law and bureaucratic order upon a fiercely independent people. They brought with them not only administration but culture. Buddhism, Taoism, and the Chinese writing system began to seep into the fabric of Vietnamese life. Resistance was inevitable. In 40 CE, two sisters, Trung Trac and Trung Ni, rose from the marshes of My Linh to lead an army against the Han occupiers. Mounted on war elephants, clad in armor, they inspired tens of thousands to rally beneath their banner. For a brief, blazing moment, they reclaimed their land, establishing a court and defying the might of the empire. But within 3 years, the Han returned with overwhelming force. The sisters, rather than face capture, chose death, riding into legend as symbols of defiance whose names are still spoken with reverence. For nearly 1,000 years thereafter, Vietnam endured under Chinese rule. Each dynasty in Beijing sought to mold the region into an obedient province, but the mountains, rivers, and forests shielded a stubborn heart. Rebellions flared, led by warriors whose names became poetry. Men and women alike who refused to see their homeland absorbed. In 938 CE, a decisive blow was struck. At the Bac Dang River, General No Nguyen lured a Chinese fleet into the shallows, where wooden stakes hidden beneath the tide impaled their ships as the water receded. The victory shattered centuries of domination, and for the first time in generations, Vietnam breathed as a free nation. No Nguyen's dynasty rose, setting the foundation for an independent realm. Over the centuries, new dynasties emerged, the Din, the early Lu, and the Lai, each leaving an indelible mark. The Lai moved the capital to Thang Long, today's Hanoi, fostering a golden age of culture, Buddhist scholarship, and temple building. Pagodas rose beside palaces, and the carved dragons of imperial citadels seemed to watch over the bustling streets. The Tran dynasty that followed was tested by one of the most formidable foes in history, the Mongol Empire. Between 1258 and 1288, 3 Mongol invasions crashed into Vietnam's borders, commanded by generals of Kublai Khan himself. Each time, the invaders were repelled, not by sheer force but by strategy, harassment in the jungles, scorched earth tactics, and another fateful battle on the Bac Dang, where General Tran Hung Dao repeated No Gwyn's trick, annihilating the Mongol fleet. But histories will kept turning. In 1400, the Ho dynasty seized power, introducing reforms but earning little popular support. Within 7 years, the Ming dynasty of China invaded, seeking to reclaim the region. Once again, Vietnamese rebels rose, this time under the banner of Lô Loi, whose guerrilla campaign drove the Ming out by 1427. His Le dynasty ushered in centuries of consolidation, codifying laws, expanding agriculture, and defending against incursions from Kampa and Siam. Despite unity, divisions began to fester. By the 16th century, Vietnam was split between the Trinh lords in the north and the Nguyen lords in the south. The Red River Delta and the Mekong Basin, each rich in resources, became rival centers of power. For centuries, civil war drained the land, leaving it vulnerable to outsiders who watched from afar. Into this fractured world came ships flying the flags of Portugal, the Netherlands, and finally France. At first, they brought missionaries and traders, their weapons sheathed and their smiles wide. But the age of European imperialism was dawning, and Vietnam, divided, weary, and rich in resources, was a jewel too tempting to ignore. The stage was set for a new chapter, one where the clash of empires would no longer be a distant tale, but a reality that would transform Vietnam's destiny. The people had resisted for centuries against the might of China and the ambitions of Mongol Khans. But what was coming would be different. The muskets and cannon of the West were arriving, and with them, a new struggle, one that would ignite the first sparks of the fire that, generations later, would engulf the land in the Vietnam War. By the dawn of the 17th century, the sails of European ships were no longer strangers to Southeast Asian waters. Galleons and caravels rode the monsoon winds into bustling ports along the South China Sea, bringing spices, silver, silk, and the ambitions of far-off crowns. Vietnam, fractured between the Nguyen lords in the south and the Trinh lords in the north, became a tempting shore for these foreign traders. They saw opportunity not just in commerce, but in influence. The first to arrive in significant numbers were the Portuguese, whose navigators had already charted much of the Asian seas. They were followed by the Dutch and later the French, who at first came with merchants, priests, and scholars. Jesuit missionaries disembarked with Bibles in hand, determined to bring Christianity to the land. They learned the language, translated scriptures, and in time developed a Romanized writing system, Quoc-Ngu, that would eventually replace the ancient Chinese script. Yet, beneath the missionary zeal and mercantile trade, the currents of European imperial ambition swirled. This was the age of colonial competition, where every coastline was a chessboard and every port a prize. The Nguyen and Trinh lords, locked in their bitter feud, found themselves courted by foreign powers, each eager to tip the balance in their favor. For the French, this chaos was not an obstacle, it was an opening. By the early 19th century, Vietnam had been nominally unified under the Nguyen dynasty, with its capital at Hue. But the unity was fragile. While the emperors of the Nguyen court tried to keep foreign influence at bay, the French Catholic Church quietly expanded its influence through schools, orphanages, and the conversion of influential local families. Priests became intermediaries in trade deals, and missionaries acted as informal diplomats for Paris. In the salons of Paris and the colonial offices of French Indochina, strategists spoke of more than just religion. They saw Vietnam as the key to dominating Southeast Asia, a gateway to China's southern markets and a fertile land rich in rice, spices, and minerals. The British held India and Burma. The Dutch controlled Indonesia. France hungered for its own Eastern Empire. The spark that ignited French military intervention came in 1858. Emperor Tu Duc, wary of Western encroachment, began to clamp down on Catholic converts, seeing them as a threat to the traditional order. Several missionaries were executed, their deaths echoing across Europe. In Paris, Napoleon III seized the moment. He framed the conflict as both a defense of the faith and an assertion of French power. French warships appeared off the coast of Danang, their black hulls glinting in the tropical sun. Cannon roared, and French Marines stormed ashore, establishing a foothold in central Vietnam. The Nguyen court, weakened by years of internal strife, could not mount a unified defense. The French advance was methodical, brutal where necessary, patient where profitable. The true turning point came in 1862, when after 4 years of intermittent fighting, the French captured Saigon. The Treaty of Saigon forced Emperor Tu Duc to cede 3 southern provinces, Gia Dinh, Dinh Tuong, and Bien Hoa, to France. It was a humiliation for the Nguyen dynasty, and a clear signal that the West had come to stay. But France's appetite did not end with southern Vietnam. The colonial strategists in Paris envisioned a buffer zone to shield their holdings from British influence. This meant taking Cambodia, with its rich forests and waterways, and Laos, with its mineral wealth. One by one, through diplomacy backed by gunboats, these territories fell under French control. By 1887, the map of Southeast Asia had changed forever. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were merged into the administrative unit known as French Indochina. Saigon was transformed into the Pearl of the Orient. French boulevards cut through the heart of the city, lined with stately buildings modeled after Parisian architecture. Markets bustled with imported goods, fine wines, luxury fabrics, and intricate clocks. To the colonial elite, this was progress, a civilizing mission in the tropics. But beneath the grandeur lay another truth. The rice that filled Saigon's markets was harvested by Vietnamese peasants who no longer owned their fields. Heavy taxes stripped away what little they earned, and the French forced farmers to prioritize cash crops for export, rice, rubber, coffee, over food for their own villages. The wealth flowed not into Vietnamese hands, but into the coffers of Paris. For the peasantry, the civilizing mission meant long hours in the sun, backs bent over paddies or latex trees, under the watch of colonial overseers. For the educated elite, it meant watching their own traditions eroded as French culture became the official standard. Schools taught in French, history lessons glorified France's empire, and local customs were recast as relics of a lesser civilization. This cultural reshaping was deliberate. The colonial administration believed that to govern effectively, they had to mold the Vietnamese into evolus, colonial subjects who spoke French, dressed in European clothes, and thought in European ways. But the deeper they tried to transform Vietnam, the more resistance brewed beneath the surface. In the countryside, whispers spread. Small uprisings flared and were swiftly crushed. Yet every execution, every exile, planted seeds of bitterness. Men and women who once fought for their emperor now fought for something more elusive, the soul of Vietnam itself. By the turn of the 20th century, resistance was becoming organized. Secret societies formed, pamphlets circulated, and nationalist leaders emerged. Among them, a young man from Nay and province would soon rise. A man who had watched his people suffer under the French yoke and dreamed of a day when Vietnam would stand free. His name was Nguyen Sinh Cung, but history would remember him by another name, Ho Chi Minh. The French had come with promises of faith, trade, and progress, but left fields stripped, villages impoverished, and a nation's pride wounded. Their footprint was heavy, and it sank deep into the soil of Vietnam. And though they ruled with confidence, they had unknowingly set in motion the forces that would one day drive them out. Forces led by the very people they had tried to reshape. The colonial chapter was far from over. France would build railways, ports, and cities, but also prisons, gallows, and graves. The Vietnamese would endure decades of exploitation, but they would not forget. The struggle for independence, born in the rice fields and whispered in the shadows of Saigon streets, was gathering strength. And when it came, it would shake the foundations of the French Empire. In the late 19th century, under the heavy hand of French colonialism, a child was born in the quiet hamlet of Kim Lien, Nayan Province, a region known for its poverty but also for producing poets, scholars, and rebels. The year was 1890, and the land groaned under foreign rule. To his parents, he was Nguyen Sin Kung. To history, he would become Ho Chi Minh. Nayan was no ordinary backdrop for a revolutionary childhood. It was a land of stubborn soil and stubborn hearts, where centuries of resistance to foreign domination were etched into the collective memory. Stories of the Trung sisters, of No Nguyen's river ambush, and of Lu Loi's victory over the Ming were told as bedtime tales. The boy listened, absorbing each story as if it were a prophecy. His father, Nguyen Sin Sac, was a Confucian scholar and a man of principle, too proud to bow easily to colonial authority. His mother, Hong Ti Lon, was known for her resilience and quiet dignity. From them, young Kung inherited both the fire of resistance and the patience of endurance. In the village school, he learned classical Chinese characters alongside Kwakngu, the Romanized script the French promoted. But education under the French was a double-edged sword. It opened doors to knowledge, yet was designed to glorify France and diminish Vietnamese pride. Even as he excelled in his studies, Kung felt the dissonance between the world in his textbooks and the reality outside his classroom. By adolescence, he had witnessed the cruelty of colonial taxation, the humiliation of elders before French officials, and the grinding poverty of the peasantry. He saw fields owned by Vietnamese farmers transformed into plantations for the French elite. He saw men in white pith helmets treated as masters, while his own people were reduced to laborers on their own land. His father's career, too, was a lesson in injustice. Nguyen Sin Sac's refusal to compromise his principles brought him into conflict with colonial administrators, eventually costing him his position as a magistrate. Disillusioned but not defeated, he instilled in his son a deep mistrust of foreign rule and an unshakable belief in self-determination. By his teenage years, Nguyen Sin Kung was restless. The colonial classroom could no longer contain him. He longed to see the world beyond the rice paddies and narrow village lanes, to understand the forces that had shackled his homeland. In 1911, under the name Nguyen Tat Ton, he left Vietnam as a kitchen helper aboard the French liner Amiral La Touche Treville, bound for Marseille. It was a departure both literal and symbolic. Like many before him, he left in search of opportunity, but unlike most, he was also embarking on a journey to study the mechanisms of empire from its very heart. The French dockyards, the bustling markets of Marseille, and the industrial cities of Europe revealed to him the wealth that colonialism extracted from the labor of the colonized. His travels took him far beyond France. He worked odd jobs in the United States, from New York to Boston, witnessing the struggles of American workers and the racial divides of the early 20th century. In London, he labored in kitchens and observed the grandeur of the British Empire, its riches built on the toil of subjects from Africa to Asia. By the time he returned to Paris in the years after World War I, when Tat Ton was no longer just an observer, he was a student of global politics. He followed the debates of socialists and anti-colonialists, mingled with activists from Africa and the Middle East, and read voraciously on revolutionary thought. The streets of Paris, so far from the paddies of Nay En, became his political classroom. In 1919, a historic opportunity arose. The Versailles Peace Conference, where world leaders promised a new era of self-determination. Believing in the rhetoric of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, Nguyen drafted an 8-point petition demanding independence and basic rights for the Vietnamese people. It was a simple, reasoned appeal. The petition was ignored. Neither Wilson nor the French delegation would meet with him. The rejection was a turning point. If the West's professed ideals of liberty and equality could not extend to Vietnam, then the path to freedom would have to be carved by Vietnamese hands alone. It was during this period that Nguyen Tat Ton began adopting new names, both to protect himself from colonial surveillance and to embody the evolution of his political identity. Among these was Ho Chi Minh, meaning he who enlightens. The name would become a rallying cry for millions. In Paris, Ho immersed himself in socialist circles, publishing articles in anti-colonial newspapers and joining the French Communist Party. Marxism-Leninism appealed to him not as an abstract theory, but as a practical tool for dismantling imperialism. He saw in it a blueprint for uniting peasants and workers against their exploiters. Yet his fight was not confined to Europe. Throughout the 1920s, Ho traveled extensively: Moscow, Canton, Bangkok, building networks, training cadres, and learning the art of revolutionary organization. In southern China, he mentored young Vietnamese nationalists, laying the groundwork for a movement that would one day challenge both French and Japanese occupation. By 1930, his efforts bore fruit in the creation of the Indochinese Communist Party, an organization dedicated to the liberation of all of French Indochina. It was a coalition of workers, peasants, and intellectuals, united by the dream of a free Vietnam. Ho's life by this point was one of constant motion, his existence shadowed by colonial agents. But the hardships only deepened his resolve. He had seen the arrogance of colonial capitals, the solidarity of oppressed peoples, and the possibility of revolution when theory met action. For the French, he was a wanted agitator. For the Vietnamese poor, he was a voice speaking their truth in the language of global revolution. And for himself, he was a man on a mission, one that would take decades to fulfill, through wars against two empires, until the red flag flew over a united Vietnam. The boy from Nay and had left home with a bundle of clothes and the curiosity of youth. He would return as Ho Chi Minh, the embodiment of Vietnam's struggle for self-determination, and the architect of a fight that was only just beginning. When Ho Chi Minh returned to Asia in the late 1920s, he was no longer just an idealistic traveler collecting lessons from the world. He was a revolutionary with a blueprint. Years in Paris, Moscow, and Canton had shown him that anti-colonial struggles could not rely on petitions, moral appeals, or the goodwill of great powers. Freedom would be won by the disciplined mobilization of the oppressed. He began his work in secret, moving through southern China, Siam, modern-day Thailand, and remote corners of Indochina. Ho organized training centers for Vietnamese exiles. These makeshift schools were hidden in rented houses, backrooms, or village temples. Here, small groups of young men and women learned not only political theory but also how to distribute propaganda, organize strikes, and survive under constant surveillance. In 1930, these scattered cells were unified under the Indochinese Communist Party, ICP. Its mission was clear: to overthrow French colonial rule, establish independence for Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and create a government based on the alliance of workers and peasants. The ICP adopted a red flag emblazoned with a yellow star, a symbol that would one day become the emblem of the Vietnamese nation. The French, however, wasted no time in striking back. Colonial intelligence networks hunted down ICP members, raiding safe houses and arresting organizers. Prisons in Hanoi, Saigon, and Pulo Condor swelled with political prisoners. Some were executed. Others endured years of hard labor in tropical heat. But repression only spread the message. Stories of bravery and martyrdom traveled from village to village, stoking anger. Ho himself operated from exile, aware that his presence in Vietnam would trigger an immediate manhunt. He traveled between Moscow, where he attended the Comintern, and China, where he worked with Chinese communists to coordinate anti-colonial efforts. Each move was calculated, each meeting an opportunity to secure resources, training, and allies. In the early 1930s, the ICP launched strikes and uprisings in Nay En and Ha Tin, Ho's home province. Peasants seized land, attacked landlords, and formed Soviets to govern themselves. For a brief moment, red banners flew over liberated villages. But the French responded with overwhelming force. Machine guns, artillery, and mass arrests. The revolt was crushed, leaving thousands dead. These early defeats were sobering lessons. Ho realized that a successful revolution required not only courage but also the careful timing of mass mobilization. Striking prematurely, without broad preparation or favorable conditions, could destroy the movement. Patience, he understood, was as much a weapon as the rifle. The 1930s brought further challenges. Across the globe, fascism was on the rise, and in Asia, Japan's military ambitions were turning south. By 1937, Japanese troops had invaded China and occupied large swaths of its territory. Ho, operating in China at the time, watched with interest and concern. Japan's advance threatened the French colonial order, but it also posed a new danger to Vietnamese sovereignty. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, France was soon consumed by the German invasion. The colonies were left vulnerable. In 1940, Japan took advantage, occupying Vietnam while allowing French administrators to remain in place. Vietnam was now under a strange double occupation, French colonial authorities answering to Tokyo's military governors. For Ho, this was both crisis and opportunity. The French were weakened, their legitimacy shattered. The Japanese were seen as another foreign invader. The moment had come to unify all strands of resistance, communist, nationalist, and otherwise, into a single front. In 1941, in the remote highlands of northern Vietnam, Ho convened a meeting that would change the course of history. From this gathering emerged the Viet Nam Doc Lap Dong Minh Hoi, or Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. Unlike the ICP, the Viet Minh's platform was broad. Independence first, ideology later. Anyone committed to ending foreign rule could join. The Viet Minh established bases in rugged, forested regions, far from the reach of Japanese patrols. From these strongholds, they trained guerrilla fighters, gathered intelligence, and built networks of local support. The Red River Delta, the northern mountains, and the Laos border became arteries of resistance. Ho's leadership style was both strategic and symbolic. He spoke plainly to peasants, promising land reform and relief from crushing taxes. He urged discipline among fighters, no looting, no mistreatment of villagers, strict respect for local customs. Such rules distinguished the Viet Minh from both Japanese troops and corrupt colonial militias, earning them the trust of the countryside. The movement's military brain was General Vo Nguyen Giap, a former schoolteacher turned master strategist. Giap believed in the power of guerrilla warfare, small, mobile units striking unexpectedly, then melting back into the jungle. His approach was informed by both Chinese revolutionary tactics and the centuries-old traditions of Vietnamese resistance. As the Pacific War raged, the Viet Minh fought a shadow war against the Japanese. They sabotaged rail lines, ambushed convoys, and assassinated collaborators. At the same time, they cultivated covert ties with the Allies, who saw the Viet Minh as a useful tool against Japanese forces. American OSS, Office of Strategic Services, officers even trained some Viet Minh units in weapons and tactics. By 1945, the war's tide was turning. Japan's empire was crumbling under the weight of Allied offensives. In August, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki hastened their surrender. Across Vietnam, Japanese troops began to withdraw. The power vacuum was immediate and dangerous. If the French returned quickly, the dream of independence could be crushed before it began. The Viet Minh acted with lightning speed. In what became known as the August Revolution, they seized towns, overran garrisons, and occupied government offices. In Hanoi, crowds filled the streets, waving the red flag with its golden star. Ho Chi Minh stood before them in Ba Dinh Square on September 2, 1945, and declared Vietnam's independence, quoting from America's own declaration, "All men are created equal." It was a moment centuries in the making, a culmination of resistance stretching from the Trung sisters to the present. But the euphoria was fleeting. The French, humiliated in Europe but determined to reclaim their colony, were already making plans to return. And they were not coming alone. For Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, The road to revolution had led them to independence's doorstep. But to hold it, they would need to fight again, this time against a colonial power backed by the emerging geopolitical logic of the Cold War. The First Indochina War was about to begin. The summer of 1945 was one of the most volatile moments in modern Vietnamese history. The world was reeling from the final blows of World War II, and in the heart of Southeast Asia, power was shifting with breathtaking speed. The Japanese Empire, once feared as an unstoppable force, was collapsing. The French colonial administration in Vietnam was a shadow of its former self. For the first time in decades, the dream of independence felt within reach. But to understand the ferocity of what came to be known as the August Revolution, one must understand the mood of the Vietnamese people in those days. Years of dual occupation, Japanese military control layered over French colonial bureaucracy, had left the population exhausted. Rice had been requisitioned in obscene quantities to feed Japanese forces and ship abroad, leading to a famine in 1944-45 that killed up to 2 million people. Villages were hollowed out by hunger, fields lay fallow, and the dead were buried in shallow graves beside the paddies. It was in this desperate climate that the Viet Minh, the broad nationalist coalition led by Ho Chi Minh, became more than a resistance group. They were the only organized force with the reach, discipline, and moral credibility to act. Their guerrillas had been striking at Japanese patrols for years, but their true power came from their connections to the countryside. Farmers who hid fighters in bamboo groves, villagers who passed intelligence from mouth to mouth, women who smuggled weapons in baskets of vegetables. In early August 1945, the news came like a thunderclap. The United States had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan was preparing to surrender. The political vacuum that followed was as dangerous as it was promising. Every revolutionary in Hanoi knew the French would try to return. Every colonial veteran in Paris knew Indochina was still considered French soil. Ho Chi Minh and his comrades moved swiftly. In mid-August, they convened in the village of Tan Treo in the northern mountains. Beneath the shade of forest trees, representatives from across the resistance gathered. Ho addressed them simply. The time had come to strike. Waiting would mean losing the momentum. Acting would mean risking everything. They chose action. The Viet Minh mobilized nationwide. From the northern highlands to the Mekong Delta, orders went out for coordinated uprisings. Guerrillas emerged from the forests, students took to the streets, and workers seized warehouses and administrative offices. In the space of days, Japanese garrisons melted away, too demoralized to fight a war already lost. In Hanoi, the uprising unfolded with electric speed. On August 19th, tens of thousands filled the streets, waving the red flag with its yellow star. French and Japanese officials, powerless and bewildered, watched the tide of humanity sweep through government buildings. By nightfall, the Viet Minh controlled the capital. Saigon's uprising was more chaotic. Here, the Japanese presence was stronger, and various nationalist factions vied for influence. Still, Viet Minh cadres gained control of key sites and rallied crowds, though skirmishes with rival groups hinted at the political fractures that would soon complicate the revolution. The climax came on September 2, 1945, in Ba Dinh Square, Hanoi. Under a blazing sun, hundreds of thousands gathered. Ho Chi Minh, dressed in a simple khaki suit, stepped to the microphone. His voice, though thin from years of illness and hardship, carried with force. All men are created equal. The Creator has given us certain inviolable rights. The right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. The words were lifted almost directly from the American Declaration of Independence, a deliberate appeal to the ideals of the West. Ho spoke of Vietnam's long history of resisting foreign domination, of the suffering under Japanese and French rule, and of the Vietnamese people's right to govern themselves. The crowd roared its approval. For a moment, it seemed as though the centuries-long dream of sovereignty had been realized. Yet the revolution's triumph was precarious. In the South, British troops landed in September, not to support Vietnamese independence, but to oversee the Japanese surrender and pave the way for French reoccupation. In the north, Chinese nationalist forces entered under Allied agreement, ostensibly to disarm the Japanese but also to assert influence. The Viet Minh now faced a chessboard crowded with foreign powers. They held the capital and much of the countryside, but their control was fragile, their supply lines thin, and their armories light. Many of their fighters carried antiquated rifles or captured Japanese weapons. Against them loomed the prospect of France's return, backed by modern artillery, tanks, and potentially American support. Ho Chi Minh, ever the strategist, sought to buy time. He opened negotiations with the French, signing the March 6, 1946 agreement, which allowed French troops to replace Chinese forces in the north in exchange for recognizing Vietnam as a free state within the French Union. It was a gamble, a way to remove one foreign army without immediately fighting another. But tensions quickly escalated. In Haiphong in November 1946, a dispute over customs duties spiraled into open conflict. French warships shelled the city, killing thousands. Days later, on December 19th, Ho Chi Minh issued a call for nationwide resistance. The First Indochina War had begun. The August Revolution had been a dazzling success in its speed and scope, seizing control from collapsing occupiers in a matter of weeks. But it was also a fragile victory, born in a moment when the old order had fallen but before the new one could be secured. The Viet Minh had raised the flag of independence, but now they would have to defend it against one of the world's great colonial powers. The world would soon discover that the Revolution of 1945 was only the opening chapter in a struggle that would span decades, crossing from the age of European empires into the high-stakes arena of the Cold War. And for Vietnam, the euphoria of freedom was about to be tested in fire. The guns of the August Revolution had barely cooled before the air filled again with the crack of rifle fire. By late 1946, Vietnam's fragile peace with France had shattered. The shelling of Haiphong and the bloody fighting in Hanoi marked the point of no return. The Viet Minh had taken up arms not in celebration, but in defense. From the outset, the French held the advantage in conventional warfare. They had artillery, armored vehicles, aircraft, and a professional army drawn not only from France but from its global empire, North African tirailleurs, Senegalese riflemen, and foreign legionnaires hardened by other colonial wars. Against them stood a Vietnamese force whose fighters were often armed with little more than bolt-action rifles, homemade grenades, or even spears. Ho Chi Minh and his commanders knew they could not meet the French in open battle. Instead, they turned to the one strategy Vietnam had perfected over centuries: guerrilla warfare. Small units moved silently through the forests, attacked isolated outposts, cut supply lines, and vanished before French reinforcements could arrive. General Vo Nguyen Giap, once a schoolteacher and history student, became the architect of this shadow war. He understood that the battlefield was not just the jungle floor but the minds of the people. Every ambush, every skirmish, was meant to wear down the French will and convince the Vietnamese peasantry that the Viet Minh were their protectors. The French, accustomed to fighting conventional armies, struggled against an enemy they could not pin down. Their patrols found themselves walking into traps, roads mined with explosives hidden beneath bamboo mats, bridges rigged to collapse under their weight, or paddy fields seeded with sharpened punji stakes. Villages became contested ground. When the French entered, the Viet Minh melted away, only to return once the soldiers left. This cat-and-mouse game exhausted the colonial troops, forcing them to spread themselves thin across a vast countryside they could never fully control. The Viet Minh's survival depended on the support of the people. In liberated areas, they redistributed land from absentee landlords to poor farmers, reduced rents, and mobilized entire communities to contribute to the war effort. Men fought, women carried supplies, and children served as lookouts and messengers. The war was not waged by an army alone. It was embedded in the very fabric of rural life. Still, the Viet Minh faced shortages of weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies. Capturing French equipment in ambushes became a key source of arms. Blacksmiths fashioned crude mortars, and workshops deep in the jungle repaired rifles salvaged from the battlefield. The ingenuity was remarkable, but it could not fully bridge the gap. For the first few years, the Viet Minh fought largely in isolation. The Allied powers, preoccupied with post-war reconstruction and the emerging Cold War, had little interest in aiding a communist-led movement in Southeast Asia. The United States, in particular, began to lean toward supporting France, seeing the Viet Minh through the lens of anti-communist containment. Everything changed in 1949. Across the northern border, Mao Zedong's communist forces defeated Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, establishing the People's Republic of China. For Ho Chi Minh, this was a turning point of almost immeasurable importance. Suddenly, Vietnam shared a frontier with a powerful ally who shared its ideology. Within months, Chinese advisors, weapons, and training began flowing into northern Vietnam. The support was both material and strategic. Chinese officers taught the Viet Minh how to coordinate larger units, maintain supply networks, and integrate political education into military operations. The flow of arms transformed the battlefield. Mortars, heavy machine guns, and small artillery pieces, carried over rugged mountain passes, gave the Viet Minh new teeth. For the first time, they could contemplate operations beyond quick raids, launching full-scale assaults on fortified French positions. Chinese aid also provided something less tangible but equally vital: confidence. No longer isolated, the Viet Minh saw themselves as part of a broader communist movement stretching from Beijing to Moscow. This ideological solidarity reinforced their determination to endure the long war ahead. The French quickly recognized the shift. In 1950, the Viet Minh launched coordinated offensives along the Chinese border, targeting French strongholds like Dong Qui and Chao Bang. The victories were stunning. French forces, cut off and surrounded, suffered heavy casualties, and their retreat turned into a rout. These battles marked the beginning of a new phase. The Viet Minh, once a shadowy guerrilla force, were evolving into a people's army capable of blending hit-and-run tactics with set-piece battles. French commanders now faced an adversary growing in both skill and firepower. The psychological tide was turning as well. In Paris, the war was beginning to look less like a colonial police action and more like a costly quagmire. In Hanoi, the tricolor still flew over French headquarters, but beyond the cities, much of northern Vietnam was slipping into Viet Minh control. For Ho Chi Minh and Giap, the road ahead was still long, but the war no longer felt like a fight for mere survival. The guerrilla embers, fanned by the winds from China, were beginning to blaze into a campaign that could challenge French dominance directly. The stage was set for an even greater showdown, a battle in a remote valley whose name would become synonymous with colonial defeat, Dien Bien Phu. But before that day came, the Viet Minh would hone their strategy, their weapons, and their resolve, preparing for the decisive blows that would end nearly a century of French rule. By late 1953, the First Indochina War had dragged on for 7 exhausting years. The French military still clung to its belief that superior firepower and professionalism could crush the Viet Minh. But morale was wearing thin, costs were mounting, and Paris was under increasing pressure to bring the conflict to an end on favorable terms. They needed a decisive blow, a battle that would break the back of Ho Chi Minh's army. Enter General Henri Navarre, the newly appointed commander of French forces in Indochina. Navarre devised a bold plan: to lure the Viet Minh into a set-piece battle in a location where French firepower, especially their air support, could annihilate them. The chosen site was Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northwest Vietnam near the Laotian border. The logic seemed sound. Dien Bien Phu lay astride key supply routes the Viet Minh used to aid their allies in Laos. If the French could build a heavily fortified base there, they could block these routes, threaten Viet Minh operations in the northwest, and force General Vo Nguyen Giap into a conventional confrontation. In late 1953, French engineers and paratroopers descended into the valley. They built airstrips, bunkers, artillery emplacements, and a network of strongpoints named after women: Gabrielle, Beatrice, Isabel, Elaine. Navarre believed that from this fortress, supplied by air, the French could withstand any siege the Viet Minh might attempt. What the French underestimated was the logistical genius and sheer willpower of their adversary. General Giap did not see a fortress. He saw a trap, but not for himself. He saw a chance to turn Dien Bien Phu into the graveyard of French ambitions. In the mountains surrounding the valley, Giap began assembling an army of nearly 50,000 troops. Thousands of porters, men, women, even children, hauled supplies over rugged trails. Bicycles were loaded with up to 300 kilograms of rice, ammunition, and artillery shells, pushed through mud and jungle. The most astonishing feat was the movement of heavy artillery. The French assumed the steep mountains and dense forest would prevent the Viet Minh from bringing big guns close enough to threaten the base. But Giap's soldiers dismantled artillery pieces, dragged them up narrow trails, and reassembled them in hidden mountain emplacements, camouflaged and dug into the earth. By March 1954, the trap was ready. French aerial reconnaissance failed to spot most of Giap's positions, and Navarre remained confident. On March 13th, the Viet Minh unleashed a devastating artillery barrage on strongpoint Beatrice. Within hours, it was overrun. 2 days later, Gabrielle fell after a night of brutal fighting. French air support, the cornerstone of Navarre's plan, began to falter. Giap's gunners targeted the airstrip, cratering it with shells and rendering it unusable. Supply planes were forced to parachute cargo into the valley, much of which fell into Viet Minh hands. The garrison was effectively cut off. The siege dragged on. Rain turned the valley floor into a swamp. French trenches collapsed under shell fire, bunkers flooded, and the stench of death hung in the humid air. Wounded soldiers lay in makeshift hospitals with dwindling medical supplies. Giap was methodical. He avoided costly frontal assaults, instead tightening the noose trench by trench, strongpoint by strongpoint. His artillery pounded the French day and night, while sappers crept forward under cover of darkness, cutting through barbed wire and laying explosives. The psychological toll was immense. French troops, many from colonial units with no deep stake in the war, fought bravely but began to feel abandoned. Requests for reinforcements or breakout attempts were denied or deemed impossible. Navarre's gamble was turning into a disaster. By early May, the French positions were collapsing. On May 6th, Giap ordered a final, massive assault. Thousands of Viet Minh stormed the remaining strongpoints, swarming over trenches and into bunkers. The French defenders, exhausted and out of ammunition, could not hold. On May 7, 1954, the tricolor was lowered. Over 9,000 French troops were taken prisoner, many in terrible condition. The once proud fortress of Dien Bien Phu was in Viet Minh hands. The French high command was stunned. The psychological impact on Paris was shattering. The battle was more than a military defeat, it was a political earthquake. For the first time, a colonial army backed by a major European power had been decisively beaten by a nationalist, communist-led liberation movement in the post-war era. It sent shockwaves through Asia, Africa, and the halls of the United Nations. In Geneva, the peace talks that followed would redraw the map of Indochina. France's dream of reasserting its authority over Vietnam was dead. The war had entered a new phase, one that would soon draw in another foreign power, far larger and more determined than France: the United States. Dien Bien Phu was not merely a battle won by firepower and numbers. It was a triumph of strategy, endurance, and the will of a people who had fought foreign domination for centuries. And it was the warning shot for a new, even bloodier conflict that lay ahead. The victory at Dien Bien Phu had broken France's will to continue the fight, but it had not secured the unified Vietnam Ho Chi Minh had dreamed of since his youth. The war was over, but the peace would be shaped not only in Hanoi and Saigon, but in the conference rooms of Geneva, where the world's superpowers loomed over the table. The Geneva Conference of 1954 brought together representatives from France, the Viet Minh, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and the non-communist states of Southeast Asia. Officially, it was about ending both the Korean War and the First Indochina War. Unofficially, it was about carving up the Cold War map. For Ho Chi Minh and General Vong Nguyen Giap, the battlefield victory meant they came to Geneva with leverage. But even they knew they could not dictate terms entirely. The Cold War was at full tilt, and their communist allies, China and the Soviet Union, were more interested in stability and avoiding a direct clash with the West than in supporting an immediate, total victory in Vietnam. The result was a compromise that cut straight through the heart of the nation. Vietnam would be temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The North would be governed by Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, while the South would remain under the state of Vietnam, led by Emperor Bao Dai and his French-backed administration. Both sides were to withdraw their forces behind the line, and nationwide elections were scheduled for July 1956 to reunify the country under one government. On paper, it was a peaceful roadmap. In reality, it was a fragile truce built on mistrust. The division was not simply political. In the north, Hanoi bustled with revolutionary fervor. Ho Chi Minh's government set about implementing land reforms, collectivizing agriculture, and promoting socialist education. Peasants who had supported the Viet Minh's war effort were rewarded with redistributed land, while landlords and perceived collaborators were punished, often harshly. In the south, the French quickly withdrew, leaving behind a shaky government under Bao Dai. Into this vacuum stepped a new figure, Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist who had spent years in exile. Backed by American advisors, Diem became prime minister in 1954 and soon maneuvered Bao Dai out of power, declaring himself president of the newly named Republic of Vietnam. Diem was fiercely anti-communist, which made him the perfect partner for Washington's strategy of containing communism in Asia. But his rule was authoritarian and deeply divisive. He favored Catholics in a predominantly Buddhist country, filled key posts with family members, and cracked down ruthlessly on political opponents. The United States, still haunted by the loss of China to communism in 1949, saw South Vietnam as a crucial domino in the larger game. President Dwight D. Eisenhower spoke openly of the domino theory. If Vietnam fell to communism, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and beyond would follow. This belief ensured that the U.S. would pour money, weapons, and military advisors into Saigon. Ho Chi Minh, meanwhile, viewed the Geneva settlement as a bitter pill swallowed under pressure from his allies. He and the Viet Minh leadership were confident that the 1956 elections would deliver them a nationwide mandate. They had the prestige of defeating France, the loyalty of much of the peasantry, and a disciplined political apparatus. But Diem had no intention of holding those elections. Backed by the U.S., he argued that the North would not allow a free and fair vote, and that any election under Ho's control would be rigged. In reality, Washington and Saigon feared that Ho would win decisively. By 1955, the split between North and South was hardening. The border at the 17th parallel became a militarized zone, with each side fortifying their positions. Refugee movements added to the tension. Nearly 1 million people, many of them Catholics, fled the North for the South, encouraged by U.S.-backed propaganda campaigns. Smaller numbers of peasants and political activists moved north, seeking a socialist future. In Hanoi, the party prepared for a long political struggle, but they also quietly began laying the groundwork for renewed armed resistance in the South. Caches of weapons were hidden, contacts re-established, and former Viet Minh fighters who had stayed in the South were instructed to blend back into rural life, waiting for the signal to act. In Saigon, Diem focused on consolidating his power. His regime launched the Denounce the Communists campaign, arresting thousands suspected of Viet Minh sympathies. Many were tortured or executed. Others simply disappeared. Far from eliminating dissent, these policies sowed resentment, especially in the rural areas where Diem's government was weakest. The divide was now not just political but ideological, cultural, and personal. The North cast itself as the true champion of independence, pointing to its victory over France. The South portrayed itself as the shield of a free Vietnam against totalitarian communism. Neither side could accept the legitimacy of the other. By the late 1950s, the promise of peaceful reunification was dead. The Geneva Accords had given Vietnam a breathing space, but instead of healing, the country had hardened into two rival states, each preparing, whether openly or in secret, for the next stage of the struggle. And in the jungles and paddies of the Mekong Delta, the seeds of that next conflict were already sprouting. The South's repression and the North's determination to reunify would soon give rise to a new insurgency, one that would draw in a superpower whose involvement would change the fate of Vietnam forever. The ink on the Geneva Accords was barely dry when the first signs of renewed conflict began to stir in the rice paddies, jungles, and back alleys of South Vietnam. The war against France had ended, but the political wounds were deep, and for many, the division at the 17th parallel felt like an amputation rather than a peace. In the countryside, especially in the Mekong Delta, thousands of former Viet Minh fighters had stayed behind after 1954, blending back into rural life. They farmed, taught, or worked in villages, but they did not forget. Many had been ordered by the northern leadership to remain in place, maintaining clandestine networks that could be reactivated when the time was right. Ngo Dinh Diem's government, determined to root out communist influence, launched the Denounce the Communists campaign in 1955. Villagers were encouraged, and often pressured, to publicly accuse neighbors of Viet Minh ties. Accused suspects faced arrest, torture, and, in some cases, execution. The campaign, far from breaking the communist underground, drove many moderates into opposition and deepened the loyalty of former Viet Minh to the cause. In the North, Ho Chi Minh and the Politburo initially pursued what they called the political struggle line, avoiding open military confrontation in the South while focusing on socialist transformation at home. Land reform, collectivization, and education campaigns swept through the Red River Delta. But these reforms were harsh, often violent, and created their own internal unrest, which the party later had to correct. By the late 1950s, the North's patience with the political approach began to fray. Reports from the South described widespread repression, executions of communist cadres, and the erosion of the underground network. The Southern leadership warned that without action, their movement would wither. In 1959, a crucial decision was made in Hanoi. The 15th plenum of the Vietnamese Workers' Party authorized the use of armed struggle in the South. It was not yet an all-out war, but it was a green light for coordinated insurgency. The seeds that had been lying dormant since 1954 were now given water and sunlight. To support this, the North began developing a clandestine supply route through Laos and Cambodia, a network of jungle paths, mountain trails, and hidden way stations that would become legendary as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In its early days, the trail was primitive. Narrow footpaths, bamboo bridges, and pack animal routes, used by small groups carrying weapons, food, and messages. Meanwhile, in the South, the emerging insurgency adopted the name Viet Cong, a term originally used by Saigon as an insult, short for Vietnamese communists, but one that the fighters eventually embraced. The Viet Cong operated in small, flexible units, staging ambushes, assassinating village chiefs aligned with Diem, and distributing propaganda to win rural hearts and minds. The movement's strength came from its integration into rural society. Fighters often farmed by day and carried out attacks by night. They relied on family networks, traditional village solidarity, and the promise of land reform to maintain support. In contrast, Diem's government was seen by many peasants as distant, corrupt, and aligned with landlords. By 1960, the insurgency had reached a point where it could openly declare its political identity. That year, in the jungles of Tay Ninh Province, the National Liberation Front, NLF, was formed. It presented itself as a broad coalition of anti-Diem forces, communists, nationalists, and disaffected Southerners. Though the communists held the reins, the NLF's platform emphasized independence, social justice, and reunification, appealing to Southerners disillusioned with Diem's rule. It was both a political and military organization, blending propaganda campaigns with guerrilla warfare. The goal was to undermine Diem's authority village by village, until the South became ungovernable without massive outside support. Diem, however, was not blind to the threat. His regime responded with counterinsurgency programs, including the Strategic Hamlet Program, which sought to relocate villagers into fortified compounds to isolate them from the Viet Cong. In practice, it often uprooted communities, disrupted farming, and created more resentment than security. The North steadily expanded the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By 1961, it included truck routes, hidden supply depots, and even underground hospitals. North Vietnamese advisors began infiltrating the South, bringing training, organizational skills, and the discipline of the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, to local guerrilla units. American involvement deepened in parallel. The U.S. sent military advisors, helicopters, and aid to bolster Diem's forces. Washington viewed the insurgency not as a nationalist rebellion, but as a communist offensive directed by Hanoi, part of the global Cold War chessboard. For Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, the strategy was clear. Bleed the South slowly, stretch its forces thin, and force the Americans to commit more and more resources to a conflict they could not win politically. The Viet Cong were not seeking decisive battlefield victories yet. They were seeking to erode the legitimacy of Diem's government until it collapsed from within. By the early 1960s, South Vietnam was a country at war in all but name. Roads were unsafe outside major towns. Assassinations were common, and the Viet Cong flag, red with a yellow star, appeared in more and more villages. The government in Saigon still held the cities, but the countryside was slipping away. What had begun as scattered acts of resistance after Geneva was now a coordinated insurgency. The seeds planted in the shadows of 1954 had taken root, nourished by repression, ideology, and the memory of earlier victories. The stage was set for the next, bloodier chapter, a war that would draw in 500,000 American troops and become one of the most defining conflicts of the 20th century. When John F. Kennedy took the oath of office in January 1961, Vietnam was already a thorn in Washington's side. The insurgency in the South was growing bolder, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was expanding, and Ngo Dinh Diem's government, while firmly anti-communist, was alienating much of its own population. For the young president, Vietnam was a test of American resolve, of the domino theory, and of his administration's ability to outmaneuver communism without plunging into another Korea. The U.S. presence in South Vietnam at that time was small but growing. American military advisors were already embedded in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, training troops, planning operations, and providing logistical support. Helicopters, armored personnel carriers, and U.S.-supplied rifles began flowing into the South. But Washington insisted these were not combat forces. Officially, America was only there to help the Vietnamese help themselves. Kennedy believed in counterinsurgency, a strategy that combined military action with political and economic reform. Programs were launched to improve rural security, build infrastructure, and strengthen Diem's administration. But the reality on the ground was far from the theory. Corruption, inefficiency, and Diem's stubbornness undermined American efforts, while Viet Cong attacks intensified. By 1963, South Vietnam was in political crisis. Diem's favoritism toward Catholics over the Buddhist majority sparked massive protests, culminating in the self-immolation of Thich Quang Duc in Saigon, an image that shocked the world. Washington began to doubt whether Diem was the man to lead the fight against communism. That November, Diem and his brother Nhu were assassinated in a coup carried out by ARVN generals, with tacit American approval. The power vacuum that followed left South Vietnam politically unstable, with one military government after another rising and falling in quick succession. The Viet Cong, sensing weakness, pushed harder. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson inherited a volatile situation after Kennedy's assassination later that month. Johnson, a master of domestic politics, saw Vietnam through the prism of the Cold War. He feared that a U.S. withdrawal would embolden communist movements worldwide and damage America's credibility with allies. The tipping point came in August 1964 in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. U.S. naval vessels, operating off the coast of North Vietnam, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. While the details of the second reported attack remain disputed to this day, the incident gave Johnson the political opening he needed. Within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president broad authority to take all necessary measures to protect U.S. forces and assist any Southeast Asian nation threatened by communism. It was, in effect, a blank check for war, and Johnson intended to cash it. At first, the escalation was measured. Increased bombing raids against North Vietnam, more military advisors, and expanded aid to the ARVN. But by early 1965, it was clear that the South Vietnamese army alone could not contain the insurgency. The Viet Cong were not only surviving, they were gaining ground. In March 1965, the first official U.S. combat troops, 3,500 Marines, landed at Da Nang. Their initial mission was to protect the airbase, but it marked a symbolic turning point. The United States was no longer merely advising. It was now fighting. The troop buildup accelerated rapidly. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 U.S. soldiers were in Vietnam, supported by massive air power. Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against the North, was launched with the aim of breaking Hanoi's will and cutting the flow of supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But the bombing failed to cripple the North's resolve. Instead, it hardened their determination. The trail was repaired as quickly as it was bombed, and supplies continued to flow. The jungle canopy shielded much of the network from American aircraft, while local populations provided cover and support to Viet Cong units. On the ground, U.S. troops faced a war unlike anything they had trained for. The enemy was elusive, the terrain unforgiving, and the front lines non-existent. Villages could be friendly by day and hostile by night. Ambushes, booby traps, and sniper fire took a steady toll on morale. The American public initially supported the intervention. Johnson promised that the war could be won without major sacrifices at home, assuring citizens that we are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. Even as troop numbers soared. For Hanoi and the Viet Cong, the arrival of U.S. forces was both a challenge and an opportunity. They adjusted their strategy, avoiding large-scale battles in favor of wearing down the Americans through attrition, stretching the war until U.S. public opinion turned against it. By late 1965, the Vietnam War had been transformed. What began as an advisory mission to prop up a faltering ally was now a full-scale conflict involving one of the most powerful military machines in history. The stakes were no longer just about Vietnam. They were about the credibility of the United States in the global Cold War. And yet, for all the firepower America could bring to bear, it was fighting an enemy that had already outlasted the French, endured decades of hardship, and believed that time itself was on their side. The stage was set for a long and bloody stalemate, one that would test the will of both nations to the very core. When Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965, the Pentagon envisioned it as a swift, crushing blow to North Vietnam. The logic was simple. Sustained aerial bombardment would destroy military infrastructure, cripple supply routes, and force Hanoi to negotiate on American terms. The skies above the north soon thundered with the engines of B-52s, F-105 Thunder Chiefs, and Navy attack planes launched from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin. For Washington, Rolling Thunder was also psychological warfare. The campaign was designed to show that the United States had the will and the capacity to punish aggression. Targets included bridges, rail yards, ammunition depots, and factories, but in reality, the bombing extended to villages and farmland, causing civilian casualties that hardened Vietnamese resolve rather than shattering it. Hanoi had anticipated this. North Vietnamese forces had spent years dispersing their industry, hiding weapons caches deep underground, and constructing elaborate networks of tunnels and bunkers. Roads destroyed by bombs were repaired overnight, sometimes by teams of villagers carrying nothing more than shovels and baskets. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became a lifeline of astonishing resilience. Despite relentless bombing, supplies moved south daily, on foot, by bicycle, in trucks that traveled only at night, and even on boats along hidden jungle waterways. The more the U.S. bombed, the more the trail expanded into a web that stretched across Laos and Cambodia. Rolling Thunder also drew North Vietnam's allies deeper into the conflict. The Soviet Union and China supplied surface-to-air missiles, radar systems, anti-aircraft guns, and jet fighters. North Vietnamese gunners learned to anticipate bombing runs, and American pilots soon faced one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the world. On the ground in South Vietnam, the American strategy mirrored the air war, a campaign of attrition. The goal was to kill Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops faster than they could be replaced, measured in the grim arithmetic of body counts. This thinking shaped the notorious search and destroy missions carried out by U.S. units. In these operations, soldiers were airlifted into suspected enemy territory by helicopter, scouring villages and jungles for guerrilla forces. The tactic relied on superior mobility and firepower, but often ended in frustration. The Viet Cong rarely stood and fought pitched battles. They melted away into the jungle, only to reappear elsewhere. The war's battlefield was unlike any in American experience. Jungle humidity rotted equipment and fatigued soldiers. Leeches clung to legs, monsoon rains flooded foxholes, and the enemy's traps were a constant threat. Punji stakes coated in poison, tripwire grenades, and mines buried on narrow trails. In villages, the lines between friend and foe were blurred. Some locals offered rice and shelter to U.S. patrols. Others provided intelligence and supplies to the Viet Cong. American commanders grew wary of anyone outside the wire, while villagers learned to hide their allegiances for survival. Helicopters became the symbol of America's war in Vietnam. The UH-1 Huey carried troops into battle, evacuated the wounded, and ferried supplies. They gave U.S. forces unmatched mobility, but also tied them to a war that required constant airlift. Without helicopters, many operations simply could not be sustained. The war of attrition was measured not by territory gained but by kill ratios. Commanders reported enemy body counts as a metric of progress, but these numbers were often inflated or misleading. A firefight that killed a handful of Viet Cong might be reported as dozens. A village destroyed might be claimed as an enemy base eliminated. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong adapted. They dug extensive tunnel networks, entire underground cities with sleeping quarters, workshops, kitchens, and hospitals. The most famous, at Siu Chi, allowed guerrillas to move unseen beneath the feet of U.S. troops, strike suddenly, and vanish as if into thin air. For the civilians of South Vietnam, the mid-1960s brought an intensification of hardship. Villages caught between the Viet Cong and USARVN operations faced constant danger. A night could bring guerrilla recruiters. The next morning could bring artillery fire or airstrikes. American firepower was unmatched. Artillery barrages, napalm strikes, and gunships could devastate enemy positions. But each bombed hamlet, each civilian casualty, eroded the South Vietnamese government's legitimacy and drove more villagers toward the insurgency. Rolling Thunder continued year after year, its intensity waxing and waning with political decisions in Washington. Yet despite dropping hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives, the campaign failed to achieve its primary goal: breaking the will of the North Vietnamese. Instead, it convinced Hanoi that only a protracted war could drive the Americans out. By 1967, U.S. troop strength in Vietnam had swelled to over 500,000, yet victory remained elusive. The war of attrition was grinding down both sides, but the United States had far more to lose politically. Each month brought rising casualty lists and no clear sign of progress. In Hanoi, the leadership prepared for a bold shift in strategy, one that would take the war directly into the heart of South Vietnam cities, challenge American claims of progress, and shock the world. That offensive would come in early 1968, in an eruption of coordinated attacks that would mark a turning point in the entire war. The Tet Offensive. By late 1967, the war seemed locked in stalemate. U.S. commanders, led by General William Westmoreland, spoke confidently of a light at the end of the tunnel. Body counts were high, American firepower was devastating, and major Viet Cong units had been pushed back from key areas. But beneath the surface, Hanoi was preparing a gamble that would challenge everything Washington thought it knew. The plan emerged from the highest levels of the North Vietnamese leadership. General Vong Nguyen Giap and the Politburo believed that a massive, coordinated offensive during Tet, the Lunar New Year holiday, could achieve multiple goals. Spark a popular uprising in the South, shatter the ARVN's morale, and prove to the American public that victory was far from near. It was an audacious idea. Traditionally, Tet was a time of ceasefire, when soldiers on both sides returned to their families. The very expectation of calm would serve as cover for the offensive's preparations. For months, troops and weapons were quietly moved into position, hidden in jungles, villages, and even within the cities themselves. The operation would target more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations across South Vietnam, an unprecedented scale for a war that had mostly been fought in rural areas. The aim was not necessarily to hold these locations, but to strike everywhere at once, overwhelming the enemy's capacity to respond. In the early hours of January 30, 1968, the first wave of attacks began in the Central Highlands and northern provinces. The next day, as Tet celebrations began, the offensive exploded across the country. Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, Can Tho, and dozens of other urban centers came under sudden, coordinated assault. In Saigon, shock spread as gunfire erupted in the streets. Viet Cong commandos attacked the U.S. Embassy, breaching its outer wall and engaging in a fierce firefight with Marines. Though the assault was quickly repelled, the image of insurgents penetrating the heart of American power in Vietnam was broadcast worldwide. In Hue, the offensive turned into one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the war. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops seized most of the city, raising their flags over the ancient citadel. For nearly a month, house-to-house fighting raged as U.S. Marines and ARVN units fought to reclaim the city block by block. By the time it was over, much of Hue lay in ruins, and thousands of civilians were dead, some executed by communist forces as suspected collaborators. The initial shock of the offensive stunned U.S. and ARVN commanders. For weeks, they had been confident that the Viet Cong were on the verge of collapse. Instead, the insurgents had shown they could strike anywhere, including the most heavily defended urban areas. Militarily, the offensive was costly for Hanoi. The Viet Cong suffered heavy casualties, with tens of thousands killed or wounded. Many units were so depleted they would never fully recover, and the hoped-for mass uprising in the south failed to materialize. But in the realm of perception, the Tet Offensive was a devastating blow to American confidence. The images of fighting in Saigon and Hue, the coffins lining the streets, and the televised reports of chaos contradicted official claims of steady progress. In the United States, public opinion shifted dramatically. For many Americans, Tet was proof that the war was unwinnable. Influential news anchor Walter Cronkite famously concluded that the conflict would end in stalemate, a verdict that reportedly led President Lyndon B. Johnson to say, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Johnson's political standing collapsed. Just weeks later, he announced that he would not seek re-election. He also ordered a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and signaled a willingness to begin peace talks, a sign that the U.S. strategy was changing. For the Viet Cong, the offensive had mixed results. They had proven their reach and shattered the illusion of American control, but they had also paid an enormous price in lives. From this point on, the North Vietnamese army would take a more direct role in major offensives, with the Viet Cong playing a supporting role. For the civilians of South Vietnam, Tet 1968 was a tragedy. The fighting destroyed homes, displaced families, and deepened the sense that nowhere in the country was truly safe. The dream of quick reunification, whether under Saigon or Hanoi, seemed further away than ever. In Hanoi, the leadership viewed the offensive as a strategic success despite the losses. It had shifted the political momentum of the war, weakened American resolve, and opened the door to negotiations from a position of strength. By the spring of 1968, the Vietnam War had entered a new phase. The United States, still committed to supporting South Vietnam, now faced growing domestic opposition, political instability, and a determined enemy willing to absorb staggering losses in pursuit of victory. The Tet Offensive had not ended the war, but it had changed its trajectory. From this point forward, the question was no longer if America could win, but how much it was willing to sacrifice before deciding the cost was too high. When Richard Nixon took the oath of office in January 1969, the Vietnam War had already claimed more than 30,000 American lives and fractured the nation at home. The Tet Offensive had eroded public trust, anti-war protests were swelling, and the U.S. was trapped in a conflict with no clear exit strategy. Nixon promised something both bold and elusive: peace with honor. The heart of Nixon's plan was Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibilities from U.S. forces to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. The idea, crafted by Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, was to strengthen and expand South Vietnam's military so that American troops could withdraw without the South collapsing to communism. Vietnamization was more than a slogan. It was a logistical and political gamble. Billions of dollars were poured into training, equipping, and modernizing the ARVN. South Vietnamese soldiers received M16 rifles, new helicopters, and armored vehicles. U.S. advisors trained them in modern warfare, hoping to mold them into a force capable of withstanding the North Vietnamese army without massive American support. Publicly, Nixon emphasized troop withdrawals to ease domestic unrest. In June 1969, the first 25,000 U.S. soldiers were sent home. More withdrawals followed, each announced in carefully staged press conferences meant to signal progress. But behind the scenes, Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, were pursuing a second, more aggressive strategy, pressuring North Vietnam to negotiate by escalating the war in ways that caught both enemies and allies off guard. One of the administration's most controversial moves was the secret bombing of Cambodia. Starting in March 1969, US B-52s pounded suspected communist sanctuaries along the Cambodian border. These raids, codenamed Operation Menu, were kept hidden from the American public and much of Congress. The rationale was to destroy supply bases along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but the bombings also destabilized Cambodia's fragile political balance. Nixon believed that striking the enemy's rear areas would shorten the war. Instead, the campaign widened it. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces adapted quickly, dispersing their logistics network even deeper into Cambodia and Laos, making it nearly impossible to shut down. In 1970, Nixon made his most dramatic gamble yet, sending U.S. and ARVN troops into Cambodia in a surprise ground invasion. The Cambodian campaign captured large caches of weapons and temporarily disrupted enemy operations, but it also sparked a firestorm of protest at home. College campuses erupted, and the Kent State University shootings, where National Guardsmen killed 4 students during an anti-war demonstration, became a symbol of the widening rift between the government and its people. At the same time, Nixon pursued diplomacy. In Paris, secret talks between Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho sought a settlement, but both sides dug in. Hanoi insisted on the removal of President Nguyen Van Thuy's government in Saigon. Washington demanded that North Vietnamese troops withdraw from the south. Vietnamization was tested in 1971 during Operation Lam Son 719, when ARVN forces, with U.S. air support, invaded Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The campaign ended in disaster. Poor planning, fierce resistance, and logistical breakdowns forced a chaotic retreat, revealing deep weaknesses in the ARVN's ability to operate without American ground troops. While the ARVN faltered in the field, the U.S. continued to hammer North Vietnam from the air. In 1972, when Hanoi launched the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional assault, Nixon responded with Operation Linebacker, an intense bombing campaign that struck targets across the north, including Hanoi and Haiphong. The Easter Offensive became a key test of Vietnamization. This time, the ARVN, with massive American air and naval support, managed to hold key cities like An Loc and Con Tum. The performance was hailed by Nixon as proof that his strategy was working, though critics noted that without U.S. firepower, the outcome might have been far different. Domestically, Nixon framed Vietnamization as a path to a peace with honor that would preserve South Vietnam's independence. But for many Americans, the ongoing bombings, the expansion of the war into neighboring countries, and the steady stream of casualties contradicted the image of winding down the conflict. In Hanoi, the leadership understood the stakes. They could afford to wait out American withdrawals, knowing that once U.S. ground forces were gone, the balance of power would shift in their favor. Every year that passed without a decisive Southern victory was a year closer to their eventual goal of reunification. By late 1972, with his re-election secured, Nixon intensified the pressure. The Christmas bombing, officially Operation Linebacker II, saw B-52s unleash a ferocious wave of strikes on Hanoi and Haiphong in an effort to force Hanoi back to the negotiating table. The shock of the bombings, combined with battlefield exhaustion on both sides, finally broke the diplomatic deadlock. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. They called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of U.S. forces, and the return of prisoners of war, but allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain in the south, setting the stage for future conflict. Nixon had achieved his version of peace with honor, but it was a fragile peace. South Vietnam was now on its own, reliant on U.S. weapons and dwindling aid, facing a determined enemy still entrenched within its borders. The Vietnamization era had ended with American combat troops leaving the battlefield, but not with victory. The war's center of gravity had shifted entirely to the Vietnamese themselves, and the final act was yet to come. The signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 brought a sigh of relief to a war-weary United States. American combat troops began their final withdrawal, prisoners of war were released, and official statements from Washington painted the agreement as a dignified end to U.S. involvement. But in Vietnam itself, peace was little more than an illusion. The accords had left a fatal flaw. North Vietnamese troops were allowed to remain in positions they held in the south, while the ARVN was expected to defend the entire country without direct U.S. combat support. The ceasefire was fragile, violated almost immediately by both sides. Skirmishes erupted within weeks, and the war shifted into a tense, grinding battle of attrition. President Nguyen Van Thuy's government in Saigon clung to the hope that continued American aid and air power would deter Hanoi from a full-scale offensive. For a time, U.S. financial and military assistance remained substantial, keeping the ARVN supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. But in Washington, the political winds had changed. The Watergate scandal was eroding President Nixon's power, and Congress, increasingly skeptical of the war, began slashing aid to South Vietnam. The Case-Church Amendment, passed in 1973, cut off funding for combat operations in Southeast Asia, effectively ending the U.S.'s ability to intervene militarily. Meanwhile, North Vietnam rebuilt and reorganized. With Soviet and Chinese support, they replenished their forces, repaired infrastructure, and expanded supply lines through Laos and Cambodia. Hanoi's leadership knew that time and American politics were on their side. In 1974, as U.S. aid dwindled, the ARVN's weaknesses grew more visible. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft, artillery units rationed shells, and soldiers went unpaid for months. Morale began to crack. In the countryside, Viet Cong influence revived, eroding Saigon's control village by village. In December 1974, North Vietnamese forces launched the Phuoc Long campaign in the south. The attack captured Phuoc Long province with relative ease, and, crucially, the United States did nothing. Hanoi interpreted the lack of American response as proof that Saigon now stood alone. By early 1975, North Vietnam's leaders made their decision: launch a final, all-out offensive to topple the South before the year's end. They called it the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, a symbolic name for the operation that would reunite Vietnam under communist rule. The offensive began in March with the assault on Ban Mi Thuot in the Central Highlands. The city fell quickly, and President Thieu, fearing a broader collapse, ordered a strategic retreat from the highlands. But the withdrawal turned into chaos. Entire ARVN units abandoned their posts, civilians flooded the roads, and panic spread. The fall of the highlands opened the way for rapid North Vietnamese advances. Hue and Da Nang, once strongholds of South Vietnam's military, were overrun in a matter of days. Each loss accelerated the South's unraveling, as refugees streamed toward Saigon in desperate hope of safety. In April 1975, the North Vietnamese army closed in on the capital. Saigon's streets filled with fear and resignation. Rumors swirled of mass executions and re-education camps for those connected to the South's government or the Americans. The U.S. Embassy, once a symbol of American power, became the focal point of a frantic evacuation effort known as Operation Frequent Wind. Helicopters ferried thousands of Americans and at-risk Vietnamese to aircraft carriers offshore. Crowds gathered at the embassy gates, pleading for rescue. On April 29th, North Vietnamese artillery began shelling Tan Son Nhut Airport, ending fixed-wing evacuation flights. The remaining escapees could only leave by helicopter, lifted from rooftops as chaos engulfed the city below. The next morning, April 30th, 1975, tanks of the North Vietnamese army smashed through the gates of the presidential palace. President Duong Van Minh, who had taken office just days earlier, surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. Scenes of desperation marked the final hours. Helicopters pushed overboard from U.S. ships to make room for more evacuees. Families torn apart in the scramble to flee, and the haunting image of the last helicopter lifting off from the embassy roof as thousands were left behind. For the people of South Vietnam, the fall of Saigon was both an end and a beginning. It ended decades of war, but began a new chapter under a unified communist government, one that would bring sweeping political and economic changes, as well as years of hardship for those labeled as enemies of the state. In the United States, the images from Saigon became enduring symbols of defeat. The war had cost more than 58,000 American lives, fractured society, and left deep scars on the nation's foreign policy psyche. For years, Vietnam would be shorthand for quagmire, misjudgment, and the limits of military power. In Hanoi, the victory was celebrated as the fulfillment of Ho Chi Minh's vision: a unified Vietnam, independent and free from foreign domination. But the cost had been staggering. Millions of Vietnamese dead, cities destroyed, and generations shaped by loss. The last helicopter over Saigon marked more than the end of a war. It was the closing act of a struggle that had begun with colonial ambitions in the 19th century and had consumed the lives of soldiers, civilians, and leaders on all sides. The echoes of that day still linger, a reminder of the thin line between hope and catastrophe in the tides of history. When the last echoes of gunfire faded on April 30th, 1975, Vietnam was finally united under a single government for the first time in over a century. Yet victory brought not the peace many had hoped for, but the daunting task of rebuilding a country shattered by 3 decades of near-constant warfare. The new Socialist Republic of Vietnam, led from Hanoi, faced a monumental challenge. Cities lay in ruins, farmlands were scarred by bomb craters, and millions of people had been displaced. Bridges, roads, and railways had been destroyed, cutting off vital connections between north and south. Entire villages had vanished under napalm and artillery. Economically, the situation was dire. The war had gutted production, drained resources, and left the country dependent on foreign aid, primarily from the Soviet Union. The U.S. imposed a trade embargo, isolating Vietnam from much of the global economy and deepening its post-war hardships. Politically, the new government sought to consolidate control. Those associated with the former South Vietnamese regime were sent to re-education camps, where they endured years of forced labor, political indoctrination, and harsh conditions. The aim was to transform opponents into loyal citizens, but for many, it was a slow form of imprisonment. Hundreds of thousands of others chose flight over submission. The late 1970s saw the rise of the boat people, desperate refugees who risked the open sea in overcrowded, often unseaworthy vessels. Many perished from storms, starvation, or piracy before reaching safe shores in places like Malaysia, Hong Kong, or the United States. Life in the unified Vietnam was further complicated by continued warfare beyond its borders. In 1978, Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia to overthrow the Khmer Rouge, whose genocidal regime had spilled violence into Vietnam. The following year, China launched a brief but bloody punitive invasion of northern Vietnam, adding to the strain on the country's fragile recovery. At home, reconstruction was slow. Collectivization of agriculture in the south, modeled on the northern system, initially led to inefficiency and food shortages. Only in the mid-1980s, with the introduction of Doi Moi, economic renovation, reforms, would Vietnam begin to shift toward a more market-oriented economy that spurred gradual growth. For the Vietnamese people, the psychological scars of the war were as deep as the physical ones. Families had been torn apart by loyalties to different sides. Entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but conflict. Memorials and cemeteries dotted the countryside, silent reminders of the cost of unity. In the United States, the legacy of Vietnam was complex and deeply felt. The war had divided the nation, eroded trust in government, and left policymakers wary of foreign military entanglements. The so-called Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to commit U.S. forces abroad for fear of another quagmire, shaped American foreign policy for years. For the veterans who returned, reintegration into civilian life was often painful. Many faced unemployment, post-traumatic stress disorder, and public indifference or even hostility. Unlike previous generations of soldiers, Vietnam veterans came home to a country eager to forget the war, not celebrate its participants. Politically, the war fueled reforms in how America went to war. The War Powers Act of 1973 sought to limit the president's ability to commit U.S. forces without congressional approval, a direct response to the perceived overreach of the executive branch during Vietnam. Culturally, Vietnam became a powerful symbol, inspiring films, books, and music that grappled with its moral ambiguities and human costs. Works like Apocalypse Now, The Things They Carried, and Born on the 4th of July offered raw depictions of the war's psychological toll, ensuring it remained a vivid part of the American consciousness. Internationally, the war altered the Cold War balance. While the United States suffered a blow to its prestige, Hanoi's victory emboldened revolutionary movements elsewhere. Yet, the heavy costs and long aftermath in Vietnam also served as a cautionary tale for communist leaders about the limits of ideology in delivering prosperity. Over time, relations between Vietnam and the United States began to thaw. In 1995, 2 decades after the fall of Saigon, the two nations formally normalized diplomatic ties. Trade, tourism, and cultural exchanges slowly grew, turning former enemies into uneasy partners in a rapidly changing world. For the Vietnamese diaspora, the war's end was never truly final. Communities of refugees in California, Texas, and elsewhere preserved memories of the lost South Vietnam, flying the yellow flag with 3 red stripes at cultural events and teaching their children about a homeland they might never see. In Vietnam itself, younger generations came of age with no direct memory of the war, their focus on education, technology, and economic opportunity rather than ideological struggle. Yet the older generations still carried the weight of sacrifice, parents and grandparents who had lost everything in pursuit of unity or survival. The legacy of the Vietnam War is therefore not a single story, but a tapestry of intertwined narratives. Triumph and loss, liberation and exile, hope and grief. It is a reminder that history does not end when the shooting stops. It echoes on in politics, in families, and in the lives of those who lived through it. Today, the war is remembered in Vietnam's museums and in America's memorials, but also in the quiet moments. A veteran's gaze at a name etched in stone, a family altar to a son who never returned, a refugee's accent carrying the memory of a country left behind. These are the living threads of a conflict that shaped not just 2 nations, but the world in which we now live. The origins of the Vietnam War stretch deep into the 19th century, when French colonial ambitions brought Vietnam under European control. In 1858, French forces, aided by Spain, launched a military campaign against the Nguyen dynasty, capturing key coastal cities. By 1887, Vietnam, along with Cambodia and later Laos, had been incorporated into French Indochina, a colonial possession designed to serve Paris's economic and strategic interests. French rule transformed Vietnam's political and economic landscape. The colonial administration imposed new systems of taxation, introduced French law, and centralized power in the hands of European officials. Vietnam's rich resources, rice, rubber, coal, and other exports, were exploited for the benefit of France, while Vietnamese farmers and laborers toiled under heavy burdens. French culture and education were promoted to create a class of westernized elites loyal to colonial rule. Schools taught in French, and the Vietnamese language was relegated to a secondary status. Yet this Western education also planted the seeds of nationalism, as a small but growing class of Vietnamese intellectuals absorbed ideas of liberty, equality, and self-determination. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Traditional village life was disrupted by new land policies that dispossessed peasants in favor of large plantations owned by French settlers or Vietnamese collaborators. The promise of modernity was offset by poverty, inequality, and cultural suppression. Resistance emerged almost immediately. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, patriotic scholars, former mandarins, and peasants alike staged uprisings against French authority. Movements such as the Kinh Vong, Aid the King, rebellion sought to restore the Vietnamese monarchy, blending loyalty to the emperor with anti-colonial fervor. As the 20th century progressed, the nature of resistance evolved. Inspired by global currents of nationalism and socialism, young Vietnamese reformers looked beyond restoring the monarchy to creating a modern, independent state. Some pursued gradual reform through education and political engagement, while others embraced radical revolution. Among the most influential of these was Ho Chi Minh, born Nguyen Sinh Cung in 1890. Traveling the world as a young man, Ho absorbed ideas from anti-colonial struggles in Asia, socialism in Europe, and the revolutionary ethos of the Bolsheviks in Russia. By the 1920s, he had emerged as a leader in the international communist movement, determined to apply Marxist-Leninist principles to Vietnam's liberation. Ho co-founded the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930, bringing together various nationalist factions under a revolutionary socialist platform. The French responded with repression, arrests, executions, and harsh crackdowns that drove many revolutionaries underground. Yet each act of resistance, even when crushed, deepened the resolve of the movement. World War II brought a seismic shift. When France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, Japan moved to occupy Vietnam, keeping the French colonial administration in place as a puppet regime. The war years were brutal, marked by famine and forced labor, but they also created an opening for the Vietnamese independence movement. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam and formed the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam, a broad nationalist coalition dominated by communists. Its goal was clear: expel both Japanese occupiers and French colonialists. The Viet Minh built strongholds in the countryside, mobilizing peasants through promises of land reform and independence. By 1945, with Japan's defeat imminent, the Viet Minh seized their chance. In August, they launched the August Revolution, taking control of major cities and proclaiming the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh, in a speech echoing the American Declaration of Independence, declared Vietnam's freedom before a jubilant crowd. But France was not ready to relinquish its colony. Determined to reassert control, French forces returned, sparking the First Indochina War in 1946. The conflict pitted the Viet Minh against a modern French army, with battles raging across the country from the Red River Delta to the jungles of the south. The war dragged on for 8 years, with the Viet Minh employing guerrilla tactics, political propaganda, and the support of rural communities. Despite superior firepower, the French struggled to suppress a movement deeply rooted in nationalism and fueled by the belief that foreign rule was unacceptable. In 1954, the war reached its climax at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam. French forces, heavily fortified, were encircled by Viet Minh troops under General Vo Nguyen Giap. After a grueling siege, the French garrison surrendered, marking a decisive victory for the independence movement. The Geneva Accords signed later that year ended French colonial rule in Indochina. Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, the north under the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and the south under the anti-communist state of Vietnam, led by Emperor Bao Dai. Elections to reunify the country were promised for 1956, but they would never take place. The stage was now set for the next phase of conflict. The deep ideological divide between North and South, the legacy of colonial exploitation, and the unresolved question of national unity would soon draw in the United States, transforming Vietnam's long struggle for independence into a central battlefield of the Cold War. In the wake of the Geneva Accords of 1954, Vietnam stood divided. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam, set about rebuilding after decades of war. The South, under Emperor Bao Dai and later Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, was propped up by the United States, which viewed the division of Vietnam through the prism of the Cold War. For Washington, the stakes were framed by the domino theory, the belief that if one nation in Southeast Asia fell to communism, the rest would follow in a chain reaction threatening the entire region. Vietnam was seen not simply as a local struggle but as a front line in the global contest between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, with China as a key player. In 1955, Diem consolidated power, sidelining Bao Dai and declaring himself president of the Republic of Vietnam. A staunch anti-communist and devout Catholic, Diem was favored by Washington as a bulwark against northern aggression. U.S. aid flowed into Saigon, funding military training, infrastructure, and government institutions. But Diem's rule quickly alienated large segments of the population. His government favored Catholic minorities over the Buddhist majority, centralized power in his family's hands, and repressed political opposition. Land reforms stalled, and rural discontent simmered. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh pursued land redistribution and political consolidation. The Viet Minh transitioned into the Regular People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, while Southern Communist cadres, many of them former Viet Minh fighters, went underground, waiting for the right moment to reignite the struggle. By the late 1950s, insurgency was spreading in the South. The National Liberation Front, NLF, known to Americans as the Viet Cong, was formed in 1960 with the aim of overthrowing Diem's regime and reunifying the country under communist rule. They drew strength from rural grievances and nationalist sentiment, blending guerrilla warfare with political agitation. Initially, U.S. involvement was limited. Under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, American military advisors helped train the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and aid programs sought to win hearts and minds. But by 1961, with the situation deteriorating, President John F. Kennedy dramatically increased the U.S. commitment. Kennedy dispatched thousands more advisors, as well as helicopters, fighter aircraft, and special forces units. While officially non-combatants, American personnel increasingly found themselves engaged in firefights. The war was creeping toward a point of no return. One of Kennedy's key initiatives was the Strategic Hamlet Program, designed to isolate rural populations from Viet Cong influence by relocating villagers into fortified hamlets. While it aimed to protect civilians, in practice it often disrupted traditional life and alienated the very people it sought to win over. By 1963, South Vietnam was in political crisis. Buddhist monks staged dramatic protests against religious discrimination, including self-immolations that shocked the world. The unrest undermined Diem's legitimacy at home and abroad, even within the U.S. administration. In November 1963, with tacit American approval, South Vietnamese generals staged a coup. Diem and his brother Nhu were assassinated, plunging the country into political instability. Kennedy himself would be assassinated just weeks later, leaving the deepening Vietnam problem to his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson inherited a volatile situation: a determined insurgency in the South, a strong communist regime in the North, and a fragile Saigon government struggling to assert control. For Johnson, withdrawal was unthinkable, not only because of Cold War strategy, but also because he feared being branded the president who lost Vietnam. The turning point came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. U.S. officials claimed that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked the destroyer USS Maddox, followed by a second, disputed attack 2 days later. Johnson seized the moment to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress, granting him broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. Armed with this political mandate, Johnson escalated rapidly. In early 1965, after a Viet Cong attack on a U.S. base at Pleiku, he ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. At the same time, the first U.S. combat troops landed at Da Nang, marking the official transformation of the American role from advisory to direct combat. What had begun as a limited mission to support an ally was now a full-scale military commitment. By the end of 1965, over 180,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam, with more arriving each month. The war that Washington had hoped to prevent, a prolonged ground conflict in Asia, was now underway. Yet even in these early stages of escalation, the seeds of later problems were visible. A war fought on unfamiliar terrain, against an enemy deeply embedded in the population, with a South Vietnamese government whose legitimacy remained in question. The United States had entered the arena, but the path to victory was already obscured by the complexities of Vietnam's history and politics. When President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered Operation Rolling Thunder in March 1965, he envisioned a short, sharp shock that would compel North Vietnam to halt its support for the insurgency in the South. The plan was deceptively simple: bomb key targets, demonstrate U.S. resolve, and bring Hanoi to the negotiating table. In reality, Rolling Thunder would last for more than 3 years, from March 1965 to November 1968, becoming one of the most extensive aerial campaigns in history. The United States committed hundreds of aircraft, thousands of aircrew, and an almost limitless supply of munitions to a war of attrition fought from the skies. At the outset, U.S. planners believed that North Vietnam's relatively small industrial base and limited infrastructure made it vulnerable to strategic bombing. Railways, bridges, power plants, and military depots were all marked for destruction. The idea was that sustained pressure would cripple Hanoi's ability to wage war. But Johnson, wary of provoking Chinese or Soviet intervention, imposed strict limits on the bombing. Certain targets, including ports, major cities, and areas near the Chinese border, were initially off-limits. These political constraints meant that the campaign could never strike with full force, allowing North Vietnam to adapt and endure. From air bases in South Vietnam and Thailand, as well as from aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, waves of American bombers and fighter jets roared northward each day. F-105 Thunderchiefs, F-4 Phantoms, and B-52 Stratofortresses became the workhorses of the campaign, delivering massive tonnages of ordnance. The bombing was relentless, but the North Vietnamese were resourceful. Bridges destroyed one day were rebuilt overnight using bamboo and timber. Railroads were rerouted, convoys shifted to dirt roads, and supplies moved under the cover of darkness. Entire factories were dismantled and relocated into caves or dispersed into small workshops hidden in villages. To counter American air power, Hanoi received advanced surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, from the Soviet Union, along with radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery. These defenses made North Vietnam one of the most dangerous environments for pilots in the history of aerial warfare. U.S. losses mounted not only from enemy fire, but from the challenges of weather, terrain, and navigation. Captured pilots, including the future U.S. Senator John McCain, were paraded as propaganda trophies. Many endured years of brutal captivity in places like the infamous Hanoi Hilton prison. Their plight added another layer of political pressure back home. Meanwhile, the bombing did little to halt the flow of men and material along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, an intricate network of paths, roads, and tunnels snaking through Laos and Cambodia. Despite constant airstrikes, the trail functioned like a living organism, shifting and repairing itself faster than it could be destroyed. Rolling Thunder also carried a heavy cost for civilians. While U.S. policy officially avoided deliberate attacks on population centers, the reality of war meant that villages near military targets were often caught in the crossfire. Casualties, refugees, and destroyed homes deepened anti-American sentiment and reinforced Hanoi's narrative of resistance. On the ground in South Vietnam, the bombing campaign was paired with a rapid buildup of American combat forces. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 U.S. troops were in the country. By 1967, that number exceeded 400,000. The war was no longer a limited engagement. It had become a full-scale American military operation. The U.S. military machine brought immense firepower to bear. Artillery bases pounded suspected Viet Cong positions, helicopters ferried troops into remote battle zones, and naval gunfire rained shells on coastal targets. The war was increasingly fought with a focus on body counts and kill ratios. Statistics meant to prove progress, even as strategic success remained elusive. Johnson's hope that bombing would compel Hanoi to negotiate proved misplaced. Far from breaking North Vietnam's will, Rolling Thunder hardened it. The leadership in Hanoi framed the destruction as proof of American imperialism, rallying both domestic and international support for their cause. By 1967, frustration was growing in Washington. Despite dropping hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs, the war showed no signs of ending. Intelligence reports warned that the enemy's resolve remained unshaken and that the Viet Cong insurgency in the South was as active as ever. At home, the mounting cost in lives and treasure began to stir public dissent. Anti-war demonstrations gained momentum, and questions about the wisdom and morality of the bombing campaign became more vocal. The gap between official optimism and battlefield reality was beginning to erode public trust. In November 1968, President Johnson, battered by political pressure and looking to open peace talks, ordered a halt to Rolling Thunder. The bombing had failed to achieve its strategic goals, though it had inflicted enormous damage. The U.S. military had learned the limits of air power in a war where political will and guerrilla resilience outweighed industrial capacity. Yet the end of Rolling Thunder was not the end of the air war. In the years to come, new campaigns with fewer restrictions would return to the skies over North Vietnam. But the experience of Rolling Thunder left a sobering lesson. In Vietnam, sheer firepower could destroy, but it could not necessarily decide. By late 1967, American leaders were telling the public that the war was turning in their favor. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, declared that the enemy was unable to mount a major offensive. Washington's message was clear. The communists were weakening, and victory was within sight. But in Hanoi, a very different plan was taking shape. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong commanders, led by General Vo Nguyen Giap, were preparing an ambitious nationwide assault to break the stalemate, inspire uprisings in the South, and shatter American confidence. They chose the Tet holiday, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, as the moment to strike. Tet was traditionally a time of ceasefire, family reunions, and celebration. Using this cultural pause to mask their movements, communist forces positioned themselves across South Vietnam in the weeks leading up to the holiday. Smuggled weapons, hidden supplies, and infiltrated fighters quietly took their places in cities, towns, and military bases. In the early hours of January 30th, 1968, the offensive began. Coordinated attacks erupted in more than 100 locations, from the Mekong Delta to the northern border. The targets included provincial capitals, U.S. military outposts, and, most shockingly, the heart of Saigon itself. In Saigon, Viet Cong commandos stormed the U.S. Embassy compound, engaging in a fierce firefight that lasted several hours. Though they were eventually killed or captured, their very presence inside the embassy grounds sent shockwaves through Washington and the American media. Farther north, in the ancient imperial city of Hue, communist forces seized large sections of the city, holding them for nearly a month in one of the war's longest and bloodiest battles. House-to-house fighting reduced whole neighborhoods to rubble, and mass graves of executed civilians were later uncovered. The scope and audacity of the Tet Offensive stunned the American public. Television news brought images of burning cities, wounded civilians, and U.S. troops in desperate combat into living rooms across the country. The contrast between these scenes and earlier official claims of progress was stark and damning. Militarily, Tet was a disaster for the communists in the short term. They suffered enormous casualties, an estimated 40,000 killed, and failed to spark the widespread uprising in the South they had hoped for. Many Viet Cong units were so badly depleted that they would never fully recover. But strategically and psychologically, Tet was a turning point. The offensive proved that the enemy retained both the capability and the will to strike anywhere, at any time. It destroyed the credibility of U.S. military assessments and eroded the American public's trust in the war effort. In the United States, political shockwaves rippled outward. Prominent news anchor Walter Cronkite, after visiting Vietnam in the aftermath of Tet, concluded that the war was unwinnable and called for negotiations. President Johnson, hearing Cronkite's verdict, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Public support for the war plummeted. Massive anti-war demonstrations grew in size and intensity, and Congress began pressing for a shift in strategy. The gap between the government's optimistic rhetoric and the grim reality on the ground was now impossible to ignore. Within the Johnson administration, divisions deepened. Advisors debated whether to escalate further or seek a negotiated settlement. Johnson, weary of the political and personal toll, announced in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election, a stunning decision from a sitting president. For the soldiers in the field, Tet was a grim reminder that the war would not end quickly. Victory in Vietnam would require not just military might, but a level of political control and popular support in the South that seemed increasingly elusive. In South Vietnam, the ARVN fought bravely in many battles during Tet, but the damage to morale and stability was significant. The scale of the offensive revealed vulnerabilities in Saigon's defenses and the depth of communist infiltration in urban areas. North Vietnam, despite its losses, emerged with a strategic victory. By bringing the war's brutality to the doorstep of the American embassy and into the headlines, they had undermined U.S. political resolve in a way years of fighting in remote jungles never could. The Tet Offensive did not end the war, but it fundamentally changed its trajectory. After Tet, the question in Washington was no longer, how do we win? But, how do we get out? The battle had shifted from Vietnam's fields and cities to America's newspapers, television screens, and political chambers. In the minds of many Americans, Tet was the moment the Vietnam War became unwinnable. Not because the U.S. had lost on the battlefield, but because it had lost the faith of its own people. And in modern warfare, that loss can be decisive. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in January 1969, he inherited a war that had already fractured the American public and shaken Washington's confidence. The Tet Offensive of the previous year had exposed the gap between official optimism and battlefield reality. Nixon faced a daunting challenge: ending the war without appearing to abandon South Vietnam to communist rule. His answer was Vietnamization, a policy aimed at reducing American involvement while strengthening the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, so it could defend the country on its own. Under this plan, U.S. combat troops would gradually withdraw, while training, equipment, and air support for South Vietnamese forces would increase. Nixon sold Vietnamization to the American public as a way to achieve peace with honor. In reality, it was also a political calculation. By shifting the fighting burden to the South Vietnamese, Nixon could reduce U.S. casualties and calm domestic opposition without immediately conceding defeat. The first withdrawals began in the summer of 1969, with 25,000 troops sent home. Each subsequent year saw more reductions, yet hundreds of thousands of American soldiers remained in Vietnam, and the war itself did not end. The ARVN, while improving in size and equipment, still relied heavily on U.S. firepower and logistics. Nixon paired Vietnamization with intensified diplomacy. Secret negotiations in Paris with North Vietnamese representatives, led on the U.S. side by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, aimed to find a settlement that would allow America to leave without undermining its global credibility. But progress was slow, with both sides maneuvering for advantage on the battlefield. At the same time, Nixon expanded the war's geographic scope in an attempt to cut off the enemy's supply lines. In March 1969, he authorized a secret bombing campaign against North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia. These strikes, later revealed to the public, fueled outrage and deepened mistrust of the administration. In April 1970, Nixon escalated further by ordering U.S. and ARVN troops into Cambodia to destroy communist bases along the border. The operation sparked massive anti-war protests in the United States. At Kent State University, National Guard troops fired on demonstrators, killing 4 students, an event that became a symbol of the war's divisive impact on American society. Despite these controversial moves, Nixon continued troop withdrawals. By the end of 1971, U.S. forces had dropped to around 150,000, less than half their peak strength. Yet the fighting remained intense. In 1972, North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional assault across the demilitarized zone and into the Central Highlands. The ARVN, supported by U.S. air power and advisors, managed to hold, but only with heavy American intervention. Nixon responded with Operation Linebacker, a renewed bombing campaign against the North, targeting supply routes, military depots, and even Hanoi itself. Unlike Rolling Thunder, Linebacker had fewer restrictions and inflicted significant damage. Diplomatic negotiations finally gained momentum in late 1972. In October, Kissinger announced that peace is at hand, though the deal soon stalled over disagreements between Hanoi and Saigon. Nixon, determined to force a settlement, unleashed the Christmas bombings, an intense 11-day bombardment of North Vietnam in December 1972. The pressure worked. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all U.S. forces, the return of American prisoners of war, and a political settlement between North and South Vietnam. Nixon proclaimed that the United States had achieved its goal of preserving an independent South Vietnam. But the reality was less reassuring. The North Vietnamese army remained in place in the south, and the ARVN was left to defend the country without direct American combat support. U.S. air power and funding would continue for a time, but the war's outcome now depended largely on South Vietnam's own resilience. In March 1973, the last U.S. combat troops left Vietnam. For America, the war was officially over, but for the Vietnamese it was far from finished. Fighting between the North and South resumed almost immediately, each side accusing the other of violating the accords. In the United States, Nixon portrayed Vietnamization as a success, but critics saw it as a way of disguising a slow-motion retreat. The human cost was staggering. Over 58,000 Americans dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, and millions of Vietnamese, soldiers and civilians, killed or displaced. The war had also left scars on America's political and cultural landscape. It fueled deep distrust in government, intensified divisions between generations and political factions, and reshaped U.S. foreign policy with a new caution toward large-scale interventions. For South Vietnam, the clock was ticking. Without U.S. ground troops, its survival depended on continued American aid, strong leadership, and the ability to resist a patient and determined enemy. As events would soon show, those conditions were fragile at best. The long road to withdrawal had ended for the United States, but the final chapter of the Vietnam War, the fall of Saigon, was still to come, bringing with it images and memories that would forever define the conflict's legacy.